The train smelled like coal smoke and other people's sweat. Clara Reed had been sitting in the same wooden seat for 4 days. 4 days of rattling windows and cinder ash drifting through the gaps in the car walls. 4 days of eating hard biscuits from a cloth bag and watching the landscape outside change from green to brown to something that looked less like Earth and more like a warning. She was 26 years old, unmarried, holding a carpet bag that contained everything she intended to bring into her new life. 2 dresses, a pair of good boots she'd saved for, her mother's thimble, and a letter she'd read so many times the folds had started to tear. The letter was from a man named George Mercer. She had never seen his face. Oh, it had started the way a lot of things started for women in her situation, through a newspaper advertisement. Widower, rancher, honest man, seeking a capable woman of good character to serve as wife and mother to 7 children. The work is hard. The land is difficult. But what I offer is a real home and a faithful partner. Write if you are serious. George Mercer, Black Ridge, Wyoming Territory. Clara's sister had cut the notice out and left it on the kitchen table without a word. That said enough. Clara had been living in her sister's spare room for 2 years, sewing piecework for a tailor on Merchant Street and eating meals that were offered with a kind of careful, exhausting generosity that made her feel like a debt that kept rolling over. She wrote to George Mercer. He wrote back. His letters were plain. No poetry, no flattery. He told her the truth about the ranch, about the hard winters and the rocky soil, and the fact that the well had gone dry 2 summers running and they'd hauled water a quarter mile until the rains came. He told her his first wife had died of fever 3 years prior, and that the children were good children, just struggling in the particular way children struggle when they have lost the person who made everything feel safe. He never once promised her it would be easy. She respected that more than she could explain. They exchanged 11 letters over 5 months. He sent a rail ticket. She packed her bag, kissed her sister at the station, and tried not to think too hard about what she was doing. Black Ridge Station was not a station so much as a platform in a single building the size of a large shed, sitting in the open expanse of nowhere with a hand-painted sign that looked like it had survived a hailstorm. There were 3 other passengers who got off. 2 men in canvas coats who immediately walked away without looking at anything, and an older woman with a birdcage who was met by a man in a buckboard wagon almost before she'd cleared the steps. Clara stood on the platform with her carpet bag and looked around. The wind was cold. Not the soft cold of early spring back east, but the sharp, invasive cold of high plains in March, the kind that found the spaces between your buttons and reminded you that it had been here a lot longer than you had. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. She told herself he'd been held up. A ranch ran on its own schedule, not a train's. 15 minutes. The station attendant, a weathered man with a gray mustache, glanced at her twice from the doorway of the building, but didn't speak. 20 minutes. Then she heard boots on the platform behind her, small boots, uneven with nerves, and she turned. The boy was maybe 12, possibly younger. It was hard to tell because there was something in his face that had aged him past whatever his years actually were. He was thin in that particular way of children who have been thin long enough that it has settled into them, become their shape. His coat was too small. His hat was an adult's hat, battered, sitting slightly too large on his head. His eyes were brown and completely, utterly exhausted. He stopped about 3 feet from her and pulled the hat off. "Ma'am," he said, "are you Miss Clara Reed?" "I am," she said carefully. He nodded once, slowly, the way someone nods when they've been rehearsing what comes next and need a moment to find it. "I'm Eli Mercer," he said. My father is George Mercer." He stopped, swallowed, started again. "My father was George Mercer. He passed 4 days ago, pneumonia. It went fast. He said it the way you say something you've had to say too many times already, the words worn smooth from use. I'm sorry you came all this way." Clara stood very still. The wind moved across the platform. Somewhere down the tracks, the train that had brought her made a sound, a long, mechanical exhale, as it prepared to continue west. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "About your father." "Yes, ma'am." He turned the hat in his hands. "The eastbound comes back through around 4 o'clock. I can wait with you if you'd like." She looked at him, really looked at him. The exhausted eyes, the too small coat, the way he was holding himself perfectly still, as if stillness was the only thing keeping him together. "How many of you are there?" she asked. He blinked. "Ma'am?" "Your father's letter said 7 children. Are all 7 of you at the ranch?" A pause. He seemed thrown by the question, as if he'd been prepared for only certain responses, and this wasn't among them. "Yes, ma'am. All 7. And who's been looking after you since your father—" "I have," he said quietly. Then, a fraction too quickly. "We're managing fine." He was 12 years old and he had a dead father and 6 younger siblings, and he was standing on a train platform in March telling a stranger they were managing fine. Clara set her carpet bag down on the platform. "I'd like to see the ranch," she said. "Ma'am, I came a long way, Eli, and the train doesn't leave until 4. That gives us time." She picked the bag back up. "Show me where you're parked." The wagon was old. The horse was older. Eli drove with the focused competence of someone who had learned by necessity, not instruction, and they rode mostly in silence across a landscape that Clara could only describe as enormous, a vastness that made the sky feel like a physical weight pressing down on everything beneath it. "How far?" she asked. 4 miles. She watched the land, dry grass, rock outcroppings, a line of bare-limbed cottonwoods following what must have been a creek bed somewhere below ground, the kind of country that didn't ask if you could handle it. "What are their names?" she said. "Your brothers and sisters." Eli kept his eyes on the road. "Eli, that's me. I'm 12. Then Ruth, she's 10. Then Thomas, he's 8. Ida's 6. Samuel's 4. He paused. "Then the twins, Hattie and May. They're 14 months. 14 months. Twins." Clara did not say what she was thinking. 14 months, she repeated instead. "They were born before your mother." "No, ma'am. Mama died having them." He said it flat and bare, a fact he had long since run out of softness for. "So it's been a while that we've been doing this." They crested a low hill, and Clara saw the ranch. It was not what the letters had implied. George Mercer had been truthful about the difficulties, the dry well, the rocky soil, but there is a kind of truth that describes hardship in terms of obstacles, and a different kind that shows you what hardship actually looks like after 3 years, with no one at the center of it holding things together. The house was standing, but only in the way that something stands when it has decided not to fall yet, rather than because it has any real intention of remaining upright. The porch was missing 2 boards. One window was covered with oilskin instead of glass. The fence along the near side of the property was down in 3 places, the posts simply pulled from the half-frozen ground and abandoned. The barn looked more solid. Whoever George Mercer had been, he had known that animals needed shelter, but the yard between the house and barn was nothing but mud and dead weeds and an assortment of broken things left where they had stopped working. Eli brought the wagon to a stop and wrapped the reins around the brake post without looking at her. "I know how it looks," he said. "It looks like a ranch that needs work," Clara said carefully. "Yes, ma'am." He climbed down. "I should tell you, we don't have much food. I wasn't sure. I didn't know if you'd stay to... Anyway, Ruth made something this morning. You're welcome to it." She climbed down herself, not waiting for help, and picked up her bag. The inside of the house was warmer than the outside, which was the best thing that could be said of it at that moment. A fire was going in the stone hearth, and around it, in various states of frozen watchfulness, were 5 children. Ruth was the one Clara identified first. She was standing near the fire with her hands twisted together, watching the door with the particular expression of a 10-year-old girl who has been trying to be responsible for weeks and has no remaining capacity left for surprises. She had her brother's same brown eyes, a patched dress, hair braided but coming loose. Thomas was behind her, 8 years old, and trying to look as though he was not standing behind his sister. Ida, 6, was sitting on a 3-legged stool with her knees pulled up and both arms wrapped around them, watching Clara with the direct, unblinking stare of a child who has learned not to trust easy things. Samuel, 4, was asleep in a chair by the fire with his mouth slightly open. In the corner, in a wooden crate lined with a folded blanket, 2 small shapes made small sounds. The twins. Clara could see one small fist flexing above the crate's edge. Ruth said, "You're her." I'm her, Clara said. I'm Clara. Ruth looked at Eli. Some conversation passed between them that had no words. Then Ruth looked back at Clara. Papa talked about you, Ruth said. He wrote me good letters, Clara said. He told me about all of you. She moved slowly into the room and set her bag down against the wall. Ida turned on her stool to watch. Thomas moved slightly out from behind Ruth. He told me you were good children. Eli says you're probably going to go back on the 4 o'clock, Ruth said. Not accusatory, just stating what had been decided. Clara glanced at Eli, who had the look of someone who regretted things. I said it was an option, he muttered. Clara pulled the nearest chair out from the table and sat in it, not at the head but at the side, making herself deliberately smaller and less formal. She looked at Ruth. Can you show me what food you have? She said. Ruth blinked. What? In the pantry or wherever you're keeping things. Can you show me? Ruth looked at Eli again. Eli gave a small, helpless shrug. Ruth walked to a cabinet against the far wall and opened it. Clara looked at what was inside. Half a sack of cornmeal, a small quantity of dried beans. She estimated 2 meals worth, 3 if stretched. 3 potatoes that had seen better days. An onion. A jar of something preserved that turned out, on examination, to be wild plum jam, nearly empty. She closed the cabinet door. She sat back down. How long has it been like this? She asked. Eli leaned against the wall near the door. He was not going to lie. She could see that. He didn't have the energy for it. Since before Papa got sick, he wasn't moving well. The trading post in town extended us some credit, but they cut it off. He stopped. We've been managing. You've been managing, Clara said quietly. She looked around the room. Ida was still watching her. Thomas had come fully out from behind Ruth and was now standing in the open, apparently having decided she wasn't immediately dangerous. Samuel slept on. She made a decision the way she made most decisions, without entirely understanding it until it was already made. I need someone to take me into town, she said. The 4 o'clock, Eli started. I'm not taking the 4 o'clock, Clara said. She kept her voice even. I have $11 in my bag, Eli, and I'd like to spend it on food before it gets dark. If you take me to the trading post, we can be back by 3. The room was very quiet. Ruth said slowly, You're staying? Clara looked at her. Your father wrote me honest letters, and I gave him my word. He's not here, but you are. She paused. I don't break my word. Ruth's face did something complicated. Clara did not press it. Get your coat, Clara said. Both of you. We'll take the wagon. The trading post in Black Ridge was run by a man named Holt, who was not unfriendly but who had the careful manner of someone who had been lied to about money often enough to have developed a policy about it. He saw Clara come in with 2 Mercer children behind her, and his expression settled into something cautious. You're the mail-order bride, he said. It was not quite tactless. He said it the way you'd state a fact you assumed was known. I'm Clara Reed, she said. I understand the Mercer family has a credit account with you. Had, Holt said. I'm afraid I had to... I'm not asking you to extend it, she said. I have cash. She set the coins on the counter, stacking them with purpose. I need cornmeal, flour, dried beans, salt pork if you have it, lard, coffee if there's any, and whatever you think is a fair price. I'll go from there. Holt looked at the coins, looked at her, looked at Eli, who was standing 2 feet behind her with the expression of someone watching something they can't quite classify. You know the situation out at that ranch, Holt said, not unkindly. I'm beginning to, Clara said. George was a good man, Holt said. He said it like a memorial, a small one. Wasn't his fault the land went sour on him, but there's some things you may not know about the debt. What debt? Clara said. Holt glanced at Eli. Eli looked at his boots. There's a man named Calder Voss, Holt said carefully, in the voice of someone stepping around something in the dark. He holds a note on the Mercer property. George borrowed against the land 2 winters back when things went bad. The note was, well, it wasn't called in while George was alive, out of some kind of courtesy, I suppose. But with George gone now... How much is the note? Clara asked. $300. The number dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. Clara said nothing for a moment. $300 was not a sum she could conjure. It was not a sum most people in this valley could conjure. When is it due? She said. Voss hasn't named a date yet, Holt said. But he will, and when he does, he stopped himself. Reorganized. I'm just saying, Miss Reed, that you may want to understand the full shape of what you're walking into. I appreciate that, Clara said. She pulled the coin slightly closer and looked at him directly. Now, salt pork. Oh, they drove back to the ranch with the wagon bed loaded and the 3 o'clock light slanting across the plains. Eli had not said much since the trading post. He sat beside her on the wagon seat with his hat in his lap, rolling the brim between his fingers in the way of someone trying to work something out. You didn't know about the debt, Clara said. It was not a question. I knew there was something, he said. Papa he didn't tell me everything. I think he didn't want me worrying. Eli. He looked at her. I'm not going to pretend things aren't hard, she said, but I need you to tell me what you know, all of it. If I'm staying, and I'm staying, I need to know the full shape of it. Can you do that? He looked at her for a long moment. This boy of 12 with his father's hat and his mother's absence and 6 people behind him depending on what he did next. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. Good, she said. And you can drop the ma'am. Just Clara. He turned back to the road. After a moment, something in his jaw eased, just fractionally. Some small, guarded thing releasing. Okay, he said. Basham. Dinner that night was cornmeal mush with a piece of salt pork cut into it, which was not magnificent but was hot, and there was enough of it. Ruth cooked it, which she did with a competence that Clara noted. Thomas set the table without being asked. Ida carried bowls with great seriousness. Samuel woke up from his chair and came to the table still mostly asleep, eating the first several spoonfuls with his eyes half closed. Clara fed the twins in turns from a mash she made from the softened cornmeal, sitting cross-legged on the floor with one baby in her lap at a time. Hattie ate readily. May was skeptical, turning her head away twice before hunger won out. They were small for their age, Clara thought. Not dangerously so, but small. After dinner, when the children were put to bed, a process that took longer than it should have and involved at least 2 arguments she did not fully understand and a lost sock that required searching. Clara sat at the table by the lamp and took inventory. Not just of the food, of everything. The house needed, she counted mentally, new boards for the porch, oilskin replaced with glass on the window, chinking in 3 gaps in the exterior logs. The fence needed resetting, the well she'd have to look at in daylight. The pantry, even with what she'd bought, had perhaps 2 weeks of meals in it if she was careful, and she intended to be very careful. She had $11, minus what she'd spent. She had her thimble and her sewing skills. She had 2 hands and the knowledge that she had gotten through hard things before. She did not have $300. She blew the lamp out and lay down on the cot near the fire that Eli had set up without being asked, and stared at the darkness above her and listened to the wind against the walls of the house. It found every crack, that wind. It spoke through the gaps in the logs in a low, unceasing voice that wasn't words, but wasn't nothing either. She thought about the train she hadn't taken, about her sister's spare room, about the careful, exhausting generosity of people who love you and cannot help you. She thought about Eli's face when she'd said, I don't break my word. She closed her eyes. She slept poorly. Wash. She was up before the children, which required setting some kind of record for early rising. Eli was already in the barn. She found him there in the gray pre-dawn, forking hay to the 2 horses, the old wagon mare and a younger gelding that looked in better condition than the rest of the place, with the methodical efficiency of someone who has been doing this job since before he should have had to. You're up, he said, not startled. Either he'd heard her coming or he'd expected her. I want to look at the well, she said. It's working. It's just slow. Still. She looked around the barn. A milk cow in one stall. She had not known about a cow, filed that away. A pen in the far corner with a small number of chickens moving in it. How many eggs are you getting? 3, 4 a day. Ruth collects them. We can stretch that. She moved to the near wall where tools were hanging. 2 good axes, a saw that needed setting, various implements. What do you usually do about cash? When you need it? Papa did day labor for other ranches sometimes, before he got sick. Eli set the fork against the wall. Last fall, I hired out 2 for the Hennessy place during harvest. They paid me 50 cents a day. Clara looked at him. You were 11. Yes, ma'am. A beat. Clara, what about sewing? She said. Are there families in the valley who need it? Probably. I don't know much about that. I do, she said. I'll ask around. Between sewing and the eggs and whatever else I can find, we can make something. She paused, then said it plainly, because she had decided last night that plain was the only way she was going to survive this. $300 is going to take longer than we might have. Eli leaned against the stall gate and looked at her steadily. You know about Voss? Holt told me. Voss is... He stopped, started over. People don't cross Voss, not here. He's been here longer than most of the families, and he does things in ways that are hard to argue with. What does he want with a failing ranch? Clara said. It was a genuine question. Eli's expression shifted, something darker moving underneath. The water, he said. There's a spring on the east side of the property that feeds into the main creek, controls a big piece of the valley's water. If Voss gets this land, he gets the spring. Clara was quiet for a moment. Your father knew this, she said. I think so, Eli said quietly. I think that's why he took the loan from Voss in the first place. He thought he could pay it back and Voss would move on. But I think Voss was counting on him not being able to. The weight of it sat between them in the cold barn air. Clara said, All right. She pushed herself off the wall. First things first. Let's see about that well. The well was slow, as Eli had said, but not failed. She spent an hour that morning clearing what she could of the sediment around the base of the bucket rope and testing depth with a length of twine tied to a rock, and determined that the water was there. It just needed the casing cleaned properly, which required tools she didn't have and strength she'd have to borrow from someone. She added it to the mental list that was growing longer every hour. The list at this point included well casing, fence posts, window glass, porch boards, flour, running low faster than expected, thread for the sewing work she was planning to solicit in town, and something she couldn't quite name but felt like time. What she needed most was time. And time was the one thing Calder Voss was not inclined to give. She'd not met Voss yet. She intended to remedy that, but not today. Today there was bread to make and children to feed and a cow to milk. Ruth showed her this, managing the teaching with the careful dignity of someone who wants to be helpful without appearing to show off. And a 6-year-old with a cut on her finger that turned out to be minor, but required finding the small medicine tin she'd brought in her bag and applying enough ceremony to the treatment that Ida stopped crying. Thomas, who had been hovering at a middle distance all morning, came to the table at lunch and sat next to Clara without comment and ate his beans and bread with the stolid intentness of a child who is not yet ready to talk, but is willing to be present. She didn't push it. Samuel, 4 years old, asked her if she could make pie. Maybe, Clara said. Do you like pie? Mama made pie, he said. There was a silence. Ruth looked at her plate. Eli stared at his cup. Clara said, What kind? Apple, Samuel said, with the crinkle on top. A lattice, Clara said. Yes. I can do that, Clara said, when we have apples. She caught Eli's eye. He looked away, but not quickly enough. She saw something in his expression that might have been, under different circumstances, gratitude. That night, after the children slept, Clara took out the letter from George Mercer, the last one. The one she'd read so many times the folds were tearing. I want to be honest with you, Miss Reed, it said. I don't know that I'm asking you for something fair. The ranch is hard, and the children are good, but I am worn thin, and sometimes I worry I am asking you to walk into a situation that is worse than I have let on. I think what I can promise is that I will work beside you, and that I will not leave the hard things only to you. That is the best I can do. He had not been able to keep that promise. But the children were here, and she was here. She folded the letter and put it back. 12 days after Clara arrived at the Mercer Ranch, she was hanging mending from 3 neighboring families on a line strung between the house and the fence post when the rider came. He was not dressed like a working rancher. His coat was good, his horse was better, and the way he rode said that he had never once in his life worried about whether a particular trip was worth the expense of making it. He stopped outside the fence and looked at her. You'd be the woman, he said. I'd be Clara Reed, she said. She didn't stop what she was doing. Calder Voss, he said. He said it the way some men say their own names, like an announcement, like a statement of a fact you'd better not dispute. She turned and looked at him fully then. He was somewhere in his 50s, broad-faced, thick through the chest, with the particular confidence of a man who had been the largest thing in most rooms for long enough that he no longer thought about it. "I know who you are," she said. "Then you know why I'm here." "The note," she said. "The note," he agreed. $300, Miss Reed. George borrowed it, George is gone, and debt doesn't die with the man." He looked around the yard, at the mending on the line, the split stacked against the house, the garden she'd marked out in a corner of the yard with a stick and some twine. His expression suggested he found all of this slightly absurd. "I'm a fair man. I'll give you until the 1st of May. That's 6 weeks. Clara looked at him. 6 weeks to find $300, she said. "Or to make other arrangements," he said pleasantly. "What other arrangements?" "There are families in Cheyenne who take in children in need," he said. "Good families. The little ones especially. Twins are popular." "Get off this property," Clara said. He looked at her with something that was not quite amusement, but was in that neighborhood. "I haven't—" "You're not welcome here, Mr. Voss, and I'll ask you once politely to leave." She held his gaze without blinking. "The note will be addressed. Don't come to this house again without notice." Something crossed his face, not anger yet, but its precursor. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has surprised him and has not yet decided if it's a problem. 6 weeks, he said again. He turned his horse and rode away. Clara stood in the yard and watched him go, not moving until he'd crested the hill and disappeared. Then she turned back to the mending on the line. Her hands were not entirely steady. She made them steady. Eli was standing in the barn doorway, having materialized there at some point during the conversation. "You heard?" she said. "Yes," he said. "All right." She smoothed the shirt against the line. "We need to talk about your father's brother." Eli went very still. "You know about Uncle Silas," he said. "Your father mentioned him. Once, briefly. He didn't say much." She glanced at him. "But I think it's time for more." Eli was quiet for a long moment. The wind crossed the yard between them. "Uncle Silas left before Mama died," he said finally. There was an argument about something that happened before. I don't know all of it. Papa never talked about it much." He paused. He's not a settled man. Does he know how to work a ranch?" "He grew up on one." "Do you have an address? Somewhere he can be reached?" Eli looked at her for a long time. "There's a town in Montana he used to write from," he said, before he stopped writing. "Get me the address," Clara said. "I'm going to write him a letter." "He might not come," Eli said. "He might not even be there anymore." "He might not," Clara agreed. She went back to the mending. Around them, the plains extended in every direction, enormous and indifferent, and the wind kept up its low, steady commentary on all of it. She had 6 weeks. She had a sewing needle and a milk cow and 7 children she had not given birth to and had not known 4 weeks ago. She had a name in Montana. She started composing the letter in her head before she'd even gone inside. What she did not know, as she stood in that yard with the wind in her face and her hands pulling a shirt smooth against the line, was that her letter would reach Silas Boone in a saloon in Billings, Montana, where he was 3 days from trouble he hadn't started but would certainly finish. She did not know what the letter would do to him, how he'd read it twice standing at the bar and then step outside into the cold air and stand there for a long time not moving. She didn't know any of that. She just wrote the letter. And somewhere, a man who had been running from his own name for 5 years read it and stopped running. The letter took 9 days to reach Billings. Silas Boone read it standing at the bar of a place called the Powder Horn, which was the kind of establishment that kept its lamps low, not for atmosphere, but because lower light made it harder to see what you were drinking. He'd been in Billings for 3 weeks, doing day work for a freight operation, loading and unloading mostly, and spending his evenings in the careful, deliberate way of a man who is trying not to think. He was good at the work. He was less good at the not thinking. The letter had been forwarded twice, which explained the delay and the condition of the envelope, which looked like it had traveled in someone's boot. The handwriting on the outside was neat, controlled. Not George's hand, which he'd have recognized. Somebody else. He almost didn't open it. He ordered a second drink and then opened it. "Mr. Boone, my name is Clara Reed. I came to Black Ridge to marry your brother George and arrived to learn that he had died 4 days before my train. I have remained at the ranch because there are 7 children here with nowhere else to go and no one capable of looking after them. I am capable, but I am one person, and what I am facing requires more than one. There is a debt of $300 held by a man named Calder Voss, who intends to seize this property and scatter these children to orphanages in Cheyenne before summer. I have 6 weeks. I do not know you. I know only that you are blood to these children and that you grew up on land like this. If you are the kind of man who can be reached by that, I am asking you to come. If you are not, discard this letter and I will find another way. Clara Reed. He read it twice. Then he folded it, put it in his breast pocket, and walked outside. It was cold in Billings in late March, the kind of cold that had teeth. He stood on the boardwalk outside the Powderhorn with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the street, which was mud and horse traffic, and a woman trying to maneuver a loaded cart around a stuck wheel, and he stood there long enough that a man coming out of the saloon bumped his shoulder and told him to move. He moved. He stood at the edge of the boardwalk and thought about George. Not the last version of George, the one from the argument, the one with the hard-set jaw and the words that had gone too far on both sides, but the earlier version. George at 17 showing him how to set a fence post properly, doing it 3 times until it was done right, not impatient but not letting it go either. George at 20, the steadiest person Silas had ever known, the kind of steady that Silas himself had never managed to be. He thought about 7 children who shared George's blood and were about to be taken apart and distributed to strangers. He went back inside, paid his tab, and told the freight foreman in the morning that he was moving on. He arrived at Black Ridge Station on a Thursday, 12 days after the letter had found him. He did not look like a man arriving to save anything. He looked like what he was. A drifter in his late 30s with a week's worth of road on him, a canvas bag that held everything he owned, and a scar along the left side of his jaw that pulled the corner of his mouth into a faint, permanent angle that made him look either like he was about to say something unpleasant or had just finished doing so. He was not a large man, but he carried himself in a way that took up room, the kind of careful, economical way of someone who has learned that certain postures prevent certain problems. He hired a horse from the station livery and rode the 4 miles to the ranch without stopping to ask directions. He'd been here once, years ago, before everything went wrong. The land remembered him even if he wasn't sure it should. Clara was in the yard splitting wood when he came through the gate. She stopped when she saw him, one hand on the axe handle, and watched him ride in and dismount without particular haste. He tied the horse to the fence post and turned to look at her. They looked at each other across 20 feet of mud for a moment. "Silas Boone," she said. Not a question. "You'd be Clara Reed," he said. "I would." She set the axe head down on the chopping block but kept her hand on the handle. It was not exactly a threatening gesture, but it was not an unaware one either. She looked at him the way someone looks at a hand of cards they've been dealt, assessing, not yet decided. "You came." "I came," he said. "I wasn't certain you would." "Neither was I," he said, which was honest. She looked at the scar, not rudely, just the way a person looks at something they've been wondering about and now have the chance to see. He was accustomed to it. "Come inside," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten since Billings." "Wyoming," he said. "Stopped in Casper." "Still," she said. But Ruth saw him first from the window and went entirely silent for 30 seconds, before turning to Eli with a complex expression that Eli, who was sharpening a knife at the table, recognized as significant. He looked up and through the window and went still. By the time Clara brought Silas through the door, the kitchen had assembled itself into a kind of unplanned receiving line. Ruth near the stove, Thomas behind her, Ida pressed against the wall, Samuel holding a wooden spoon for no clear reason. Silas stopped inside the door and looked at them. They looked at him. He found Ruth's face first, the oldest girl, George's eyes. "You look like your grandmother," he said. "Your father's mother." Same set to the jaw. Ruth stared at him. "You're Uncle Silas," she said. "I am," he said. "Papa said you left," Thomas said from behind Ruth. He said it the way 8-year-olds say things, directly and without decoration. "I did," Silas said. "Why?" Thomas said. "Thomas," Clara said. "It's all right. Silas said. He looked at the boy. Your father and I had a fight, a bad one. I said things I shouldn't have, and then I left, and then I let too much time go by. He paused. That's the honest answer. Thomas considered this with the gravity of someone not yet old enough to have complicated feelings about honesty, and not yet old enough to pretend he did. Okay, he said. Eli had not said anything. He was still at the table, the knife in his hand, looking at his uncle with an expression Clara could not fully read. Not hostile, not warm, somewhere in the middle, which seemed about right for 12 years old and a dead father and a stranger showing up claiming to be family. Silas looked at him. Eli, he said. Sir, Eli said. A pause. Something in Silas's face moved slightly. I knew you when you were 2, he said. You used to follow the barn cats around and try to pick them up, and they'd scratch you every time, and you'd go right back for another one. Eli's expression shifted just slightly at the edges. I don't remember that, he said carefully. I know, Silas said. It's good to see you, that's all. Eli looked down at the knife. Yes, sir, he said again. But something in the set of his shoulders had changed, just fractionally. Clara put coffee on. After the children were in bed, she and Silas sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and she told him everything. All of it. The state of the pantry when she'd arrived, the debt, Voss's visit, the deadline. She did not soften any of it. She'd found, in the weeks since she'd arrived, that softening things was a luxury she couldn't afford, because softened things had a way of surprising you later when you'd forgotten the hard edges were still there. Silas listened without interrupting, which she noted. He sat with his coffee cup between his hands and watched her talk, and she got the sense that he was not just hearing the information, but cataloging it, sorting it into something usable. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The spring, he said, east side of the property. Yes, I know the one. He turned the coffee cup once. George and I used to fish there when we were boys. Before this was Mercerland, our father had a place 3 miles north. He paused. George got this piece when our father sold up and moved to Kansas. He worked it hard. He did, Clara said. She'd found evidence of that work everywhere, in the things built carefully before everything started falling apart, in the quality of the barn even when the house was suffering. George Mercer had been someone who put his effort into the right places, until he simply ran out of effort. He told me in his letters it was a good piece of land underneath the hard seasons. It is, Silas said. Or it was. He looked at her. What made you stay? You could have gone back. She considered the question, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give him the right version of it. I looked at Eli's face, she said, on the platform, when he told me. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. He was trying so hard to be all right, and I thought, if I get on that train, he's going to have to keep trying to be all right for 6 more people, and he's 12 years old, and there's nobody coming. She shrugged, a small, practical gesture. So I didn't get on the train. Silas looked at her for a moment. George couldn't have known what kind of person you'd be, he said, just from letters. He took a risk, Clara said. So did I. He picked well, Silas said quietly. He said it without flourish, just as a fact he'd observed and was stating. Clara looked at him across the lamp. I need to know about your past, she said. Voss is going to use whatever he can find. If there's something, Silas said. His jaw tightened slightly on the scarred side. There was a man in Colorado 4 years ago. He came at me with a knife in an alley over a card game. I don't even know if I won that hand honestly. I don't remember the night clearly enough. But he came at me, and I didn't think. It went badly. He lived, but only just, and there was a hearing, and I left Colorado before I could find out how it went. Clara absorbed this. Do you know the outcome? She said. No. Then we don't know what Voss has, she said, or whether it's even actionable. He may know the story without knowing the ruling. She looked at him steadily. Is there anything else? He met her gaze. Nothing worse than that. All right, she said. She stood up and took her cup to the wash basin. You can sleep in the barn. There's a cot near the grain store. Eli uses it sometimes when one of the animals is sick. It's not... "The barn is fine," he said. She turned and looked at him. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I want to be straightforward about that. I didn't know if this would work, but I'm glad you're here." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was hard to name, something between gratitude and the discomfort of someone who hasn't been spoken to straightforwardly in a while and doesn't entirely know what to do with it. "I'll start on the fence tomorrow," he said. "The east section. You need it up before you can move the cow out to the spring pasture." "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He took his cup to the basin, nodded once, and went out to the barn. Clara stood in the kitchen by herself for a moment and listened to the house settling around her. The small sounds of children sleeping, the fire going low, the wind that never quite stopped. One more person on the ground. It was something. Well, Silas worked. That was the simplest way to say it, and the truest. He rose before light and was in the yard before Clara, which she discovered the second morning when she came out to find the porch boards already replaced, not perfectly, but solidly, nailed flat and true. And Silas gone to the barn for the morning chores. She stood on the new boards in her coat and felt the difference, the lack of give under her feet, and said nothing about it that morning, but carried it. He fixed the fence. He looked at the well casing and drove to town for the parts he needed with money she gave him and a list she'd written, and he came back and spent half a day crouched at the well mouth working by feel in the cold, and by evening the flow was twice what it had been. He did not talk much. This was not unfriendliness. Clara had spent enough time around unfriendly people to know the difference. It was simply his nature, or what his nature had become after years of being largely alone. He said what was necessary and then returned to the work, and the work was considerable and he did not appear to mind it. The children adjusted in their various ways. Samuel decided within 48 hours that Silas was an acceptable presence, which he indicated by appearing at Silas's elbow at random intervals during the day and either asking questions or simply standing there in companionable silence. Silas tolerated this without complaint and occasionally answered the questions, which were wide-ranging and not always coherent. Ida watched from a distance for 5 days, and then abruptly appeared at breakfast one morning and sat in the chair next to Silas's and helped herself to biscuits without comment. Silas moved the butter closer to her without being asked. That was apparently sufficient. She came back the next morning and the one after. Thomas warmed more slowly, but warmed in the way of someone who had been paying close attention all along. He followed Silas to the fence work one afternoon and handed him tools without being asked, anticipating which one was needed next with a quiet, careful precision that made Silas look at him once with an expression of something like recognition. "You watch things," Silas said. "My papa said I was too quiet," Thomas said. "Your papa was wrong about that one," Silas said. Thomas didn't smile exactly, but he handed over the next post mallet before Silas reached for it. Ruth kept her distance in the way of someone who has been responsible for too long to simply stop. She was polite. She cooked alongside Clara, accepted help with the twins without complaint, and looked at Silas from across rooms with the calculated reserve of someone deciding over time whether trust was warranted. Clara understood this exactly and did not push it. Eli was harder to read. He worked alongside Silas without friction and was clearly absorbing everything. The way Silas read the soil, the way he handled the horses, the way he set posts with a level laid against them instead of guessing. Eli watched all of it with his particular quiet intensity, but he held something back. Not hostility, something more like suspension, like a judgment he hadn't yet completed. One evening, late, Clara came out to check on the horses and found Eli and Silas at the fence, not working. The light was long gone for work, but standing, Eli's forearms on the top rail, Silas a few feet down, both of them looking at nothing in particular. She stopped and stayed back, not deliberately eavesdropping, but not intruding either. "Did you and Papa argue about me?" Eli said. "I mean, about something to do with me?" A pause. "No," Silas said. "You weren't born yet. The argument was about a decision I made, that your father thought was wrong. He was right." Another pause. "It doesn't have anything to do with you." "I just wondered," Eli said, "because you left before I was born, and then you didn't come to meet me or anything." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I should have," he said. "Papa would have let you." "I know he would have." His voice was flat, but not unkind. It was the flatness of someone pressing down on something that still has feeling in it. That's one of the things I have to live with. Eli was quiet for a long moment. Are you going to leave again? He said. The question hung in the cold air. I don't know, Silas said, which was honest and maybe not what a 12-year-old needed to hear, but it was what he had. Eli absorbed this. Okay, he said finally. He pushed off the fence rail and went inside. Silas stayed at the fence for a while longer. Clara went back to the house the way she'd come, quietly, and said nothing about it. 3 weeks after Silas arrived, Voss sent a man. Not Voss himself, a hired hand named Decker, who rode up to the yard on a bay horse and had the particular manner of someone doing an errand he finds slightly distasteful but is being paid adequately for. Clara was hanging laundry. Silas was at the barn door, watching the rider without moving toward him. Message for the Reed woman, Decker said. That's me, Clara said. Decker reached into his coat and produced an envelope. Mr. Voss says the deadline is moved. You've got until the 15th of April instead of the 1st of May. Clara took the envelope and looked at it. He's moving it up, she said. Yes, ma'am. Why? Decker had the look of someone who was not paid to answer that question. I'm just delivering the message. Clara opened the envelope and read it. Then she folded it and held it at her side. Tell Mr. Voss I received his message, she said. Decker nodded, glanced at Silas, a longer look, assessing, and rode back out through the gate. Silas walked over from the barn. How much time? He said. 3 weeks less than we had, Clara said. She looked at the letter again. He's doing it because you're here. He's watched us fix the fence and the well, and he's watched the ranch start to look like something that can be held, and he's shortening the runway. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. He doesn't want us to have time to make this work. 3 weeks, Silas said. We can't raise $300 in 3 weeks. No, Clara said. Not by ourselves. She looked at him. But I've been thinking about that spring, about the water rights. She turned back toward the house with the laundry basket. And I've been thinking about Voss's other neighbors, not just us. Silas fell in beside her. He's pushed people around before, Clara said. The Hennessy family. Eli worked their harvest, they paid him fair, they're good people. The Garner widow on the South Road, the Phelps brothers who run sheep on the North Pasture, Voss has been diverting water from their creek for 2 seasons. She set the basket on the porch steps and faced him. People who have been crossed by the same man have something in common. Silas looked at her. You want to go visiting? He said. I want to go visiting, she said. He was quiet for a moment, working through it. If Voss finds out, Voss is going to do what he's going to do, Clara said. He's already moved the deadline. He's already threatened the children. I don't think there's a version of this where he decides to be reasonable. She met Silas's gaze directly. So I'd rather do something. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, but Clara had been watching his face for 3 weeks, and she could read the smaller movements now. All right, he said. We go visiting. Tomorrow, she said. Start with the Hennessy's. He nodded and went back to the barn. Ruth appeared in the doorway behind Clara. I heard, Ruth said. I know you did, Clara said. Ruth looked out at the yard, at the fixed fence and the new porch boards, and the place that was slowly, imperfectly becoming something more than it had been. Is it going to work? She said. Clara picked up the laundry basket. I don't know, she said, but we're going to try. She moved past Ruth into the house. Come help me with supper. I need to think, and thinking goes better when my hands are busy. Ruth followed her in. The fire was low. Clara put more wood on it. Outside the window, the planes ran on in every direction, indifferent as always, waiting to see what the people on them would do next. The Hennessy farm was 4 miles northeast, past a creek crossing that had gotten slippery with the late thaw, and Frank Hennessy met them in his yard with the expression of a man who has learned to be cautious about unexpected visitors. He was 60 or so, broad-shouldered in the way of someone who had been working since he was old enough to hold a tool, with a gray beard he'd trimmed recently, and hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same material as the fence posts around him. His wife, Dora, appeared in the doorway of the house within 30 seconds of the wagon stopping, which suggested she'd seen them coming from the window, and had been waiting to see what Frank decided to do. Clara climbed down before Silas could offer a hand and walked to the fence gate with her chin up and her expression open. "Mr. Hennessy," she said, "my name is Clara Reed. I'm out at the Mercer place." Frank Hennessy looked at her, then at Silas, then back at her. "I heard George passed," he said. "Sorry for it. He was a decent man." "He was," Clara said. "I came to marry him and arrived to find him gone, and I've stayed because the children needed someone to stay." She paused. "I'm not here to ask for charity. I'm here because I think we have something in common, and I'd rather talk about it plainly than dance around it." Hennessy studied her. "That'd be Calder Voss," he said. "Yes." He opened the gate. "Come in then. Dora'll put coffee on." They sat at the Hennessy kitchen table for the better part of 2 hours. Frank talked in the measured way of someone who had been holding things carefully for a long time and was now considering whether it was safe to set them down. Dora brought coffee and then sat at the table herself, which Clara suspected was not a given in that household, and listened with her hands folded and her eyes moving between Clara and her husband. What Frank told them came out in pieces, not a flood. Voss had been diverting water from the north tributary for 3 seasons, not by force exactly, but by constructing a berm on land that was technically his and technically legal, even if the effect was to choke water flow to 3 downstream properties, including the Hennessys. He'd bought out 2 families last year, both sales made under duress that couldn't quite be proven in a court. He had a relationship with Deputy Aldrin in town that was not a formal arrangement, but was something. People knew better than to file complaints. "What about the Territorial Land Office?" Silas said. Frank looked at him. "You know anything about land offices in a territory where one man controls most of the payroll?" Silas said nothing. He knew something about that, Clara gathered. "The water rights on the Mercer Spring," Clara said. "If Voss gets that land, he controls the water to the whole East Valley. Not just us. All of you." She looked at Frank directly. "You know that." "I know it," Frank said. "Then what happens next affects you as much as it affects me." Frank was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Dora was watching him with an expression Clara could not entirely read, but felt like a wife telling a husband something without speaking. "What is it you're asking for?" Frank said. "Not money," Clara said. That's not why I'm here." She leaned forward slightly. "I'm going to fight this in the land office. There are irregularities in the original note. I found them in George's papers. The terms were altered after signing, I think, and if that can be demonstrated, the note isn't valid." She paused. "But a woman alone filing a complaint about Calder Voss is something the land office can quietly ignore. A woman with a dozen neighbors standing behind her is harder to ignore. Frank looked at Silas. "And what's your part in this?" "I'm George's brother," Silas said. "I'm here because those are my brother's kids, and I let too much time go by before I remembered that." He said it flat, without embellishment. "And because what Voss is doing is wrong, and I've spent enough years walking away from wrong things." Frank looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at his wife. Dora gave him the smallest nod. "Tell me about these irregularities," Frank said. They visited 4 more families over the following week. The Garner widow, who lived alone on a south pasture and had more spine than most men twice her size, and said yes before Clara had finished explaining. The Phelps brothers, 2 of them, Caleb and Martin, who ran sheep and had been fighting the water diversion quietly for 2 years and were, by the time Clara arrived, simply waiting for something to push against. An older German-speaking couple named Brandt, who had homesteaded further east and lost a strip of land to Voss through a boundary dispute 5 years ago that still had not been properly resolved. Not everyone said yes. A man named Purvis on the West Road listened, thanked her politely, and showed her the door with the explanation that he had daughters and couldn't afford the trouble. She didn't argue. She thanked him and left and did not say anything about it on the ride home, because there was nothing useful to say. But by the end of the week, they had 7 families who had said yes, and 7 families in a valley this size was enough to mean something. What she hadn't expected was Ruth. Ruth had been listening to all of it, or enough of it, in the way Ruth listened to everything, from the corners of rooms and behind doorways and through the thin walls of a small house. And on the sixth night, when Clara was at the kitchen table with George's papers spread in front of her, Ruth sat down across from her. "I can help," Ruth said. Clara looked up. "With which part?" "The papers." Ruth looked at the documents, the loan agreement, the addendum, the land survey. "Mama taught me to read properly, and you're looking for something that doesn't match." Clara had been looking for exactly that. The specific discrepancy she'd found once and couldn't relocate in her exhaustion. She looked at Ruth. "You're 10 years old," she said. "I know what I am," Ruth said. Clara slid a portion of the papers across the table. They worked for 2 hours in silence, broken only by the fire and occasional murmurs. "This date, look at this date. And this one here." And it was Ruth who found it. Not the major alteration which Clara had already identified, but a second one. A notation in the margin of the repayment schedule, in handwriting that did not match the body of the document, that extended the repayment window by 1 year, meaning the note, as originally signed, was not yet due. "This is different writing," Ruth said, pointing without touching the paper. Clara leaned over and looked. The ink was slightly different too, lighter, applied later. "Yes," Clara said quietly. "It is." Ruth looked at her. "That means he changed it." "That means someone changed it," Clara said. "And if we can show that to the right person." "Is there a right person?" Ruth asked. The way she said it was not cynical. It was the genuine question of a child who had watched adults fail to protect things for long enough to know that institutions were not automatic. "I'm going to find one," Clara said. Ruth looked back at the papers. "I could copy this out," she said. "Write it clearly with the differences marked, so it's easier to show." Clara looked at her. This girl who had been caring more than she should since before she was old enough to know it, who had been her father's second-in-command and her siblings' de facto mother, and who was now sitting at a kitchen table at 9 in the evening offering to be useful one more time. "Yes," Clara said. "That would help." "Thank you, Ruth." Ruth pulled the paper closer and picked up a pencil. It was Silas who told her about Colorado. Not because she pushed, she didn't. She'd asked once, gotten what he offered, and left it alone. But 12 days before the deadline, he came in from the barn late and sat at the table with the look of someone who has been arguing with himself all evening and has reached a conclusion. "There's a man named Crail coming," he said. "Bounty paper, out of Colorado." Clara set down her sewing. "How do you know?" "Decker, the man who brought Voss's message. I've seen him before. He was in Pueblo when the hearing was. He recognized me." Silas's jaw moved on the scarred side. "He'll have told Voss by now, and Voss will use it." "What was the outcome?" Clara said. "The hearing." "I don't know," he said. "I left before it concluded." "Then there may not be a warrant," she said. "There may be." She looked at him. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, not fidgeting, which somehow made it worse, like a man who had already made his peace with a bad outcome and was reporting it rather than fearing it. "Are you telling me you're thinking about leaving?" she said. A pause. "I'm telling you it might be better for you if—" "No," Clara said. "Clara—" "No." She kept her voice even. "If you leave now, Voss wins. Not just on the debt. He takes everything, and those children have already lost one person who was supposed to stay." She held his gaze. "I'm not telling you what to do, but I'm telling you what the cost is." Silas looked at the table for a long moment. "If there's a warrant," he said, "and they take me, then we deal with that when it happens," Clara said. "One thing at a time." He looked up at her. Something in his face was doing something difficult, something between resolve and the particular pain of someone who has spent a long time not being worth staying for and is being asked to reconsider the premise. "You're not easy to argue with," he said. "No," she agreed. "George would have—" He stopped. "Would have what?" He shook his head slightly. "Liked you," he said. "He would have liked you a great deal." Clara looked back at her sewing. "Go to sleep," she said. "We have the Brandt family coming tomorrow morning, and I need you coherent." He got up from the table. At the door to the back hall, he stopped. "Clara." She looked up. "Whatever happens with the hearing," he said, "whatever comes out of Colorado, I want you to know that coming here was—" He stopped again. "Started differently. I stopped running when I got that letter. I don't think I'm going to start again. She held his gaze. Good, she said. Now sleep. He went. Clara sat at the table with her sewing in her lap and stared at the door he'd gone through for a moment, and then she picked up the needle and put it back to work. Pokom. Voss came himself, 4 days before the deadline. This time he didn't stop at the fence. He rode in through the gate with 2 men behind him and stopped in the center of the yard with the posture of someone who has decided that the performance of authority is sometimes more effective than authority itself. Clara came out to the porch. Silas came from the barn. Eli materialized at the corner of the house and did not come further but did not go back inside. Miss Reed, Voss said, I'm told you've been doing some visiting around the valley. I have, Clara said. It's spring. People go visiting. People have been making decisions, Voss said. Decisions about things that don't concern them. Land and water concern everyone who lives on the land and drinks the water, Clara said. Voss's gaze moved to Silas, then back to Clara. I'd like to make you a final offer, he said. Out of consideration for the children, who I understand are not at fault in their father's failures. He said failures with a particular flatness, like he was describing weather. Abandon the property. I'll give you 60 days to move, and I'll make arrangements for the children with families in Cheyenne who are prepared to take them. Separate families, Clara said. Voss paused. These things are worked out by the agencies. Separate families, Clara said again. You'd split them up. It's not a matter of We're not leaving, Clara said. One of the men behind Voss shifted in his saddle. Voss looked at her with the expression he'd used before, the one that wasn't quite amusement but lived in that territory. You have 4 days, he said, and $300 is still $300. I'm aware of the number, Clara said. I'm also aware that the note you hold was altered after signing. The repayment window in the original agreement extends to November of next year. Not this April. Not any April. She kept her voice level. I have documentation and I have witnesses, and in 3 days I'll be in front of the Territorial Land Commissioner with both. The amusement left Voss's face. That's a serious accusation, he said. It's a documented one, she said. Something moved in Voss's eyes. Not fear, something cooler than fear, more deliberate. The calculation of a man reassessing a problem. The man behind you, he said, shifting his gaze to Silas, is wanted in Colorado. Is he? Clara said. A man named Crail will be here inside the week with papers. Then we'll receive him courteously, Clara said, and examine his papers. Voss looked at her for a long moment. You're making an enemy, he said. Not a threat exactly, more like an observation he wanted recorded. I suspect I made one the day I didn't get on that eastbound train, Clara said. Voss looked at Silas one more time, then he pulled his horse around and rode out with his men behind him. The yard was quiet. Silas let out a long breath. The land commissioner, he said. Do you actually have an appointment? I will by tomorrow morning, Clara said. I'm writing to the telegraph office. He looked at her. And the Colorado thing. Was your hearing concluded or not? Clara said. I genuinely don't know. Then he doesn't know either, she said. And a man who's uncertain is playing a bluff. We call it. Eli was still at the corner of the house, very still, watching. Eli, Clara said, come eat dinner. He came. He moved past both of them toward the door and then stopped and looked up at Silas. That was good, Eli said quietly. What she did. Silas looked at the gate where Voss had ridden out. Yeah, he said. It was. The telegraph brought an answer the following afternoon. The land commissioner's office in Cheyenne would receive her in 6 days, which was 2 days past the deadline Voss had set. Clara read this and did the arithmetic and told Silas, and Silas said, Then we have 2 days we have to get through first. And she said, Yes. And they looked at each other and said nothing more about it because there was nothing more useful to say. Those 2 days were quiet in the way that certain kinds of quiet are not actually quiet. The ranch continued its routine. Morning chores, breakfast, the twins feeding, the small domestic machinery that had been Clara's architecture since the first week. But underneath it ran a current that everyone in the house could feel, and that no one talked about directly. Ruth cooked. Thomas worked alongside Silas at the hay baling without being asked, and stayed until the work was done. Ida, who had shown no previous interest in practical matters, followed Clara through the morning chores and handed things before being asked, as if proximity was a form of protection. Samuel, 4 years old, sat on the porch in the afternoon with a stick and a patch of dirt and made a fence. A small one, just a scratched outline in the dust. Clara watched him from the window and did not say anything. On the second evening, Frank Hennessy rode in. Then the Garner widow, who arrived in a buckboard with a rifle across her knees, as if she'd been expecting a specific kind of company. Caleb Phelps came at dusk, and then his brother Martin an hour later, having ridden separately from the north pasture. The Brants sent their eldest son, a large, quiet young man of 20, who shook Silas's hand and said nothing but sat down in the yard and didn't leave. Nobody had called for them. They'd simply come. Clara stood on the porch in the dark and looked at the people in her yard. 7 of them now, by lamplight, some talking, some not, and felt something she didn't have an immediate word for. Not hope exactly. Something more solid than hope. Frank Hennessy came to stand beside her. "Figured we'd spend the night," he said. "Dora's home with the kids, but she said to give you this." He pressed something into her hand, a folded cloth, and inside it a smaller paper packet that turned out to be coffee. Real coffee, the good kind, not the chicory-stretched version Clara had been managing with for weeks. She looked at it. "Tell her thank you," Clara said. "Tell her yourself," Frank said. "She'll want to hear what happened." "When it's over," Clara said. "When it's over," he agreed. Silas had come to the porch and was standing slightly behind her, not quite beside her, but close. She could feel the warmth of him in the cold evening air. "They came," he said quietly. Not to anyone specifically. "They came," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, in a long time, I haven't—" He stopped himself, tried again. "I forgot what this was," he said. "People doing something together." Clara looked out at the yard, Frank's voice carrying low across it. The Garner widow and Caleb Phelps in conversation. The young Brant man feeding the horses he'd brought, unsaddled, calmly. "So did I," she said. They stood there on the porch together in the dark, not talking, while the night came down fully over the plains and the stars came out hard and clean, and the fire the men had built in the yard threw orange light across 7 faces that were, for different reasons and in different ways, all waiting for the same morning. Inside, somewhere behind them, Ruth sang something quiet to the twins. Not a proper song, just a sound, low and steady, the kind of sound you make when you want someone small to know that the world is still there and has not, yet, gone wrong. Silas heard it. Clara saw him hear it. Neither of them spoke. They came at 2 a.m. Clara heard them before she saw them, a sound that didn't belong to the ranch's usual nighttime vocabulary, something between hoofbeats and the kind of deliberate silence that men make when they are trying to move quietly and are not quite good enough at it. She was off the cot before she was fully awake, her hand finding her boots in the dark from muscle memory alone. She crossed to the window and looked out. There were 6 of them at the gate, maybe 7. The moon was 3/4 full, and the yard held enough light to see shapes, men on horses, one of them carrying something long across his saddle that she didn't want to look at directly because she knew what it was. They'd come in slow, the way you come in when you're expecting to find people asleep and want to keep them that way. She pulled her boots on and moved to the door. Frank Hennessy was already up. He'd been sleeping in the barn with Caleb Phelps and the Brant boy, and some instinct or light sleep had gotten him to the barn door ahead of the riders. He was crouched at the gap, watching, and he turned when he heard Clara's boots on the porch boards and made a short, sharp gesture with his hand. "Stay back." She didn't stay back. She crossed the yard to him in 10 seconds and crouched at the barn door gap beside him. "How many?" she said. "7 that I can count. Decker's one of them. Don't recognize the others." Frank's voice was a breath, barely sound. "They've got torches, not lit yet." Torches. The word landed in her stomach like cold water. "The children," she said. "Silas?" Frank said. "Here!" Silas's voice came from directly behind them, which made Clara's heart kick hard before she placed it. He'd come from the other side of the barn without a sound. He had something in his right hand, the rifle she'd seen hanging near his cot, the one he'd brought from Billings that she'd not asked about. The riders at the gate were still. One of them spoke. too low to carry. "What are they waiting for?" Caleb Phelps said from the far side of the barn. He'd been awake, apparently, since before everyone else. "Making sure the house is dark," Silas said. "Making sure we're asleep." He looked at Clara. "Get back to the house." "The children need..." "Ruth can manage the children for 3 minutes," he said, quietly but without give. "I need you behind the door, not in the yard." She looked at him. "Clara," he said. Just her name, but with a weight in it that was not commanding. It was the particular voice of someone asking rather than telling, which was the more effective thing. 3 minutes, she said. She went back to the house. Right. Ruth was already in the bedroom door when Clara came through, the twins in their crate behind her, Thomas and Ida pressed against the wall on either side. Samuel sitting up in bed with the confused, unfrightened look of someone not yet awake enough to be afraid. "Someone's outside," Ruth said. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who has decided to be steady. "Yes," Clara said. She went to the far wall and pulled the heavy chest away from its position, making space behind it. "All of you here. Behind this. Stay low and stay quiet." She looked at Ruth. "Do you understand?" "Yes," Ruth said. She moved the twins' crate herself, scraping it across the floor, and then herded Thomas and Ida into the space behind the chest with the matter-of-fact authority of someone who has been moving siblings out of harm's way for years. Samuel climbed off the bed and walked to the group on his own, still not fully awake. "Is it bad, men?" he said. "Maybe," Clara said. "But there are good men outside too, more good than bad." She looked at Ruth. "Don't come out until I come back and knock twice. Only me. Do you understand?" "Who else would it be?" Ruth said. "Just making sure," Clara said. She went back to the door and Bang. Outside, the riders had moved through the gate. What happened next did not happen the way things happen in stories, where events fall into a clear sequence with clean edges. It happened the way things actually happen, all at once, overlapping, with gaps in the understanding that only filled in later. What Clara saw from the doorway, the riders in the yard, 7 of them now confirmed, spreading out in the way of men who have done this before or have been told to. Decker near the center, not a hired hand's manner anymore, but something more directed. One man already off his horse, crouching near the fence, with what she now saw clearly was a torch, not yet lit, a bottle in his other hand. What she heard, Frank Hennessy's voice from the barn, loud and deliberate, "That's far enough," and the sound of the barn door swinging open. What she did not expect, the shape that appeared from the far side of the yard, from behind the woodpile she'd been stacking for 3 weeks. Then another shape, from the corner of the chicken coop. Then the Garner widow, stepping out of the shadow of the fence with a rifle at her shoulder, and a composure that suggested this was not the first time she'd pointed one at a man who deserved it. The riders pulled up. "Lay that torch down," Frank said. He was in the yard now, out in the open, which Clara recognized as a courage she didn't fully have a name for. The man with the torch didn't move. "I said lay it down," Frank said. "This is legal business," Decker said from horseback. His voice had the aggressive steadiness of someone reciting something. "Voss holds the note on this property, and the deadline has passed. We're here to..." "It's 2 a.m, the Garner widow said, "and you've got a fire bottle. That's not legal business. That's arson." "Drop it!" Silas's voice came from the dark, to the left of the riders, closer than any of them had apparently expected, because 2 horses startled and 1 man swore. Silas stepped into the moonlight with the rifle at his shoulder, not pointing it at anyone specifically, which was somehow more concerning than if he had been. "Drop the torch and the bottle and get off this property." "There's a warrant," Decker started. "For me specifically," Silas said, "which has nothing to do with what that man's got in his hands." The man with the torch looked at Decker. Decker looked at the barn, at the widow, at Frank, at the Brandt boy who had materialized from somewhere to the right, with a fence post in his hands that he held with the ease of someone who had been breaking rocks with his arms since he was 14. He looked at Silas. "This isn't done," Decker said. "Drop it," Silas said again. Not louder, just more final. The torch hit the dirt. The bottle followed, didn't break, rolled to a stop against a fence post. 3 of the riders turned their horses without another word. 2 more followed. The remaining man, not Decker, someone else, younger, who who had the look of someone who had not entirely understood what he was signing up for when he took this job, looked at the bottle in the dirt, then at the people around him, and then rode out at a pace slightly faster than the others. Decker was last. He looked at Silas with something past professional, something personal, or the shadow of it. "Crail's coming," he said, "papers and all." "I know it," Silas said. "You should have stayed in Montana." "Probably," Silas said. Decker rode out. The yard was quiet. Frank let out a long breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. Caleb Phelps said something under his breath in a tone that might have been relief or profanity. It was hard to distinguish at that distance. The Garner widow lowered her rifle with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been holding tension in their arms and is now releasing it in stages. Clara walked off the porch and into the yard. She picked up the bottle from the dirt, corked. She could smell kerosene even through the cork. She held it for a moment and then walked to the rain barrel at the barn corner and dropped it in, where it sank. Silas came and stood beside her. "You came back out," he said. "I heard the horses leave," she said. They stood there. Around them, the people who had come out of the dark and the barn and the shadows redistributed themselves slowly, finding each other in the yard, voices coming back up to normal volume in that gradual way of people who have been quiet under pressure and are now releasing it. "He'll try again," Clara said. "In daylight, probably, with something that looks more legal." "By daylight, we'll be in front of the land commissioner," Silas said. "The hearing is in 2 days." "Then we hold 2 more days." She looked at him. In the moonlight, the scar along his jaw was a dark line, the permanent angle to his mouth unchanged, but something in his eyes was different from the man who had ridden in 3 weeks ago. Something settled, she thought, though she would not have used that word to his face because it would have embarrassed him. "Are you afraid of Crail?" she said. The warrant man. A pause. "Some," he said. "I don't know what he's carrying. That's the part that—" He stopped. "I've spent 4 years not knowing and being afraid of finding out, which is its own kind of prison." He looked at the gate where the riders had gone. "Decker's right that I should have stayed in Montana. Stayed safe. Stayed invisible." He turned and looked at her. "But I'd have spent the rest of my life knowing I did it again. Left when it was hard." Clara looked at the gate too. "I know what it's like," she said. "To leave when it's hard. I left things too before I came here. Not the same kind, but still." She paused. "It doesn't get quieter, the leaving." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It doesn't." Frank Hennessy appeared at Clara's elbow. "I'm going to suggest we make coffee," he said, "and nobody goes back to sleep until it's light, just to be on the cautious side." "The good coffee," Claire said, "from Dora." Frank looked confused. "What good coffee?" "The packet she sent with you." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm afraid I don't know what packet you're talking about, Clara. Dora didn't send any coffee." Clara stared at him. He kept a straight face for 4 more seconds, then didn't. She went inside to make the coffee. But Eli was awake, had been the whole time. Clara found him sitting at the foot of the stairs with his knees up and his back against the wall, in the dark, perfectly still. He looked up when she came in. "The little ones?" she said. "Ruth's with them. They're fine." He stood up. He was trying not to show how much the waiting had cost him, but he was 12 and the cost was visible. "What happened?" She told him, briefly and plainly. He absorbed it. "They ran," he said. "They ran," she said, "because there were enough of us." "Yes," she said. "That's exactly why." He leaned against the wall again, the tension in him going down by degrees. He had the look of someone taking stock, counting the thing that almost happened against the thing that did. "I should have been out there," he said. Not bravely, just honestly. "No," Clara said. "You should have been exactly where you were. Your job was to be between them and your brothers and sisters if it came inside. It didn't come inside." She looked at him. "That's not a small thing, Eli." He looked at the door. "Uncle Silas," he said. "He was out there." "He was," Clara said. A pause. "I'm going to be 12 for 4 more months," Eli said, which seemed to be a thought he was completing out loud rather than a statement for her benefit. "I know," she said. "Then 13. "That's generally how it works," she said. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face, and was quickly managed back into neutrality, but she'd seen it. "Can I help with the coffee?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Come on, that's up." Crail arrived the following afternoon. He was not what Clara had pictured. She'd imagined someone in Decker's mold, hard-faced, theatrical in the way of men who traded on fear. What rode up to the fence was a compact man in his 40s with a deputy's badge and a manner that was neither threatening nor friendly, simply official in the way of someone who does paperwork for a living and occasionally has to deliver it in person. He asked for Silas Boone by name, and Silas came out to the fence and they talked for 10 minutes while Clara stood on the porch and did not go inside. She watched Silas's face during the conversation, watched him take the papers Crail handed him and read them, watched something in his expression shift, not relief exactly, but the absence of attention that had been there so long she had normalized it. Crail rode back out without incident. Silas stood at the fence for a moment, the papers in his hand, and then he walked back to the house and held them out to Clara. She read the top document. The Colorado hearing had returned a verdict of self-defense. Insufficient grounds for prosecution. Case closed, 2 years ago. The paper below it was a formal notice. The warrant had never been issued. Clara read it twice. Decker knew, she said. Maybe he found out and maybe he didn't, Silas said. Or maybe Voss told him to say it anyway. He took the papers back and looked at them. 4 years, he said. I spent 4 years not writing to find out. You know now, Clara said. He folded the papers. I know now, he said. She looked at him. He was standing in the yard of his dead brother's ranch with a folded document in his hand and the particular expression of someone who has been set down after a long time being carried and doesn't quite know what to do with the absence of weight. Come help me pack the wagon, she said. We leave for Cheyenne at first light. The hearing before the land commissioner took most of a morning. The commissioner was a man named Aldgate, 50-ish, with the careful manner of someone who had learned that careful was the appropriate manner when powerful men were involved, and the facts were ambiguous. He was not immediately sympathetic. He had the look of a man who had seen plenty of frontier disputes and had his own instincts about which ones were worth the territory's time. He looked at those instincts differently when Clara laid Ruth's copied documents on his desk. She'd brought the originals too, sealed in an envelope she hadn't opened since the night she and Ruth had marked the discrepancies. She laid the copies first, Ruth's neat, precise handwriting, the differences annotated in the margins in a 10-year-old's careful hand, and then the originals beside them. Aldgate looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. The handwriting in the margin, he said finally, this notation, does not match the body of the agreement, Clara said, nor does the ink, which can be examined by anyone with adequate light. She paused. The repayment date in the original agreement is November of next year. The marginal notation added later moves it to this April. Without that notation, the note is not yet due. Aldgate looked up at her. Who prepared this copy? Ruth Mercer, Clara said. George Mercer's eldest daughter. She's 10 years old. Something moved in Aldgate's expression. She's 10, he said. She reads and writes well above her age, Clara said. She identified the second alteration, which I had missed. Aldgate looked at the documents again. This is a serious allegation against Calder Voss, he said. I have 7 neighbors who can testify to other conduct, Clara said. If it's useful, I can name them. She named them. She was careful and specific about what each had experienced. The water diversion, the boundary dispute, the bought-out families, the relationship with the deputy in town. She did not embellish. She had found, coming into this room, that the truth she had was sufficient, and that embellishing it was more likely to hurt than help. Silas said nothing through most of this. He had come in his clean shirt, the only one he owned, and sat beside Clara without fidgeting and answered the 2 direct questions Aldgate asked him about the property's water rights with the kind of simple clarity that came from having grown up on land like it. When Aldgate asked him if he intended to remain at the property, Silas said, yes, without hesitation and without looking at Clara, and she heard it and did not show what she felt about it, but she felt it clearly and specifically in the way you feel things that matter. Aldgate closed the documents and sat back. I'm going to order a full examination of the note and the alterations, he said. I'm also going to issue a temporary injunction on any seizure of the Mercer property pending that examination. He looked at Clara. That buys you time. It doesn't resolve the debt. The debt, if the note is found fraudulent, resolves itself, Clara said. If, Aldgate said, these things take time. I understand, Clara said. I'll take the injunction. Aldgate wrote while they sat there and then signed and pressed his seal and handed the document across the desk. Clara took it with both hands. Outside the land commissioner's office, on the steps in the Cheyenne afternoon, she stood with the injunction in her hands and the sound of the city around her, horses and commerce, and the ordinary noise of people doing ordinary things, and felt the particular exhaustion that comes after a long effort held at tension. Silas stood beside her. It's not over, he said. No, she said, but it's different than it was this morning. She folded the injunction carefully and put it inside her coat, against her chest. He'll fight the examination. He'll lose it, Silas said. Ruth's documentation is airtight. A 10-year-old with good eyes and a pencil beat him. Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that family. Don't tell her that, she said. She'll be insufferable. She'll be exactly right to be, Silas said. They stood there for a moment in the afternoon light, and Clara looked at him. The scar, the permanent angle to his mouth, the man who had stopped running when a letter found him in a saloon in Billings and had not started again. Thank you, she said, for staying. He looked at her with the direct, slightly uncomfortable look of someone receiving something they don't know how to hold. You didn't give me a lot of choice, he said. I gave you every choice, she said. You made them yourself. He looked away, out at the street. We should get back, he said. Ruth's going to want to know what happened, and if we don't tell her before she finds out some other way, she'll be insufferable, Clara said. I was going to say thorough, he said. She'll be both, Clara said. They walked to the wagon. What? The news about Voss moved through the valley the way news moves in small places, quickly and with additions. By the time the territorial marshal arrived in Black Ridge 3 weeks later to serve the injunction formally and begin the investigation into the note alterations, the story had accumulated layers that Clara didn't entirely recognize, and Silas had become, in some tellings, considerably more dramatic than he had been in fact. He declined to correct any of it, which she found interesting. Deputy Aldrin, the one in town with the convenient relationship to Voss, resigned before the investigation reached him, which was itself a kind of evidence that everyone understood clearly. Voss hired a lawyer from Denver, which bought him time but not much else. Frank Hennessy gave a 6-page written statement. The Garner widow gave a shorter one that was, by all accounts, considerably more vivid. The water rights question came out in the commissioner's examination in a way that was simple and damning. The original Mercer deed included explicit language about the East Spring that Voss's lawyers had apparently missed or hoped no one would find, and which made any claim of control over that water by a future owner of the land contingent on valley-wide agreement that would not be forthcoming. Voss's empire did not collapse overnight. It contracted steadily and publicly, like air going out of something that had been inflated past its honest size. Land he'd acquired under pressure became the subject of new scrutiny. Men who had been quiet began to speak. The machinery that had been running on fear ran less well when the fear had somewhere to go. Clara watched all of this from the ranch, which was not at the center of it anymore. Had become simply the place where it had started, the specific ground where someone had decided not to get on a train. She was planting the garden the afternoon a rider came from town with a letter from the commissioner's office. She opened it with dirt on her hands, standing in the turned earth, and read it. The note was formally declared fraudulent. The debt was voided. The land was clear. She read it twice and then stood in the garden with the letter at her side for a while, looking at the rows she'd turned. The kitchen garden was small but planned carefully. Beans and squash and the hardier vegetables that would survive the altitude and the short season. She'd put in a section for root crops that would store through winter. She'd put in a corner, smaller, for herbs, because Ruth had asked about herbs and it seemed a reasonable thing. Samuel appeared at the garden gate. Clara, he said. Eli says supper. I'm coming, she said. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket, next to the thimble that had been her mother's, and walked out of the garden toward the house. What? The letter from the commissioner's office sat on the kitchen table through supper, visible to anyone who looked. But Clara said nothing about it until the dishes were done and the twins were down and Samuel was asleep in his chair for the second time that week. He had a talent for it, falling asleep in chairs that no one had yet managed to address. Eli carried him to bed. When he came back down, Claire was at the table with the letter in front of her and Silas, across from her, and Ruth, standing in the doorway with the expression of someone who knows something has happened and is deciding whether to ask or wait. Thomas had appeared too, from wherever Thomas went when the house got quiet. He stood near the fireplace with his arms folded, 8 years old, and doing his best impression of a man who wasn't anxious. Clara slid the letter to the center of the table. "The debt is gone," she said. "The land is ours." The room absorbed this in its various ways. Eli sat down slowly in the nearest chair, not dramatically, just as if his legs had made a decision without consulting him. Ruth's hand came up and covered her mouth for a moment, and then came back down and she stood straighter, which was more Ruth than tears would have been. Thomas unfolded his arms and then didn't know what to do with them. Silas said nothing. He was looking at the letter from across the table with an expression that Clara could not entirely read. Something between relief and a grief she understood only partially, which was the grief of someone who has won a thing that the person who should have lived to see it will never see. "Papa's land," Ruth said finally. "Your land," Clara said. "All of you. That's what the commissioner ruled. The property belongs to the Mercer children as lawful heirs, held in trust until Eli's majority." Ruth looked at her. "And you?" "I'm not a Mercer," Clara said. It was a plain fact, stated plainly. "You should be," Ruth said. She said it with the flat directness of someone who has considered this and arrived at a conclusion and sees no reason to dress it up. The room went quiet in a specific way. Silas looked at the table. Clara looked at Ruth, who looked back at her with the steady brown eyes she'd had since the first day at the train station. The eyes that missed very little and forgave selectively, and had been watching Clara Reed for 2 months with the particular attention of a child who knows the difference between someone performing care and someone actually providing it. "That's not something you can decide," Clara said gently. "I know," Ruth said, "but it's something I think." She went upstairs. And later that night, when the house was as quiet as it got, which was never entirely quiet, because old houses breathe and children shift in sleep and the plains wind never fully stopped, Silas knocked on the kitchen door frame. Clara was at the table with the letter and a cup of tea that had gone cold, not reading, just sitting in the particular way of someone who is letting something settle. "Can't sleep?" she said. "Not yet." He came in and sat at the table, not across from her, but at the corner, which was closer. He turned his cup in his hands. Empty, she noted. He'd forgotten to put anything in it. She got up and poured water into the kettle without being asked and set it to heat. They sat in the kind of quiet that had become comfortable between them without either of them having formally decided that it would be. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone gathering courage. Silas didn't operate that way. More the silence of someone being precise, choosing words the way you'd choose a tool for a specific job. "About what I'm doing here," he said. "What I'm actually doing here, past the original reason." Clara looked at him. "I came because of the children," he said, "because of George. And that's still true." He set the cup down. But somewhere in the last 2 months it stopped being only that. The kettle was beginning to make its preliminary sounds. "You don't have to," Clara started. "I know I don't," he said. "I want to." He looked at her directly, the way he looked at things he was serious about. "I'm not a man who... I don't have much to offer that's conventional. I have a history that's not clean. I have a temper I've had to learn to manage, and haven't always managed well. I don't have money. I don't have land of my own." He paused. "What I have is that I'm not leaving. I'm not going to leave. And I know what that's worth coming from me, given everything. Is probably not..." "Silas," Clara said. He stopped. She looked at him across the corner of the table in the low lamplight. This man with his scar and his imperfect history and his empty cup and the work-roughened hands that had fixed her fence and her well and stood in her yard at 2 a.m. with a rifle and not flinched. "I know what it's worth," she said. He held her gaze. The kettle began to whistle. She got up and moved it off the heat, the sound dying, and stood with her back to him for a moment and thought about trains, about the one she'd gotten on and the one she hadn't gotten back on, about 11 letters from a man she'd never meet and one letter to a man she hadn't known she was asking to save her, about the fact that she had come west to build a life and had, against all reasonable probability, done exactly that, just not the one she'd planned, not with the person she'd planned, not in any shape she could have predicted from a spare room in her sister's house on Merchant Street. She turned around. "There's an oak tree at the east end of the property," she said. "By the spring." He looked at her. "I know it." "It's a good tree," she said. "Old. The children like it." "Clara." "I'm saying yes," she said, "if that's what you were getting to. I'm saying yes before you find a way to talk yourself out of finishing the question." Something crossed his face that she had not seen before in the time she'd known him. Something unguarded, briefly, like a window opened in a house that had kept its shutters closed for years. He said, "I hadn't gotten to the question yet." "I know," she said, "but I could see where you were going." He was quiet for a moment. "You could have let me get there," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been humor if it had a little more practice. "We've got 7 children and a ranch to run," she said. "I don't have time for long approaches." She poured the hot water into his cup. He looked down at it, still empty of anything but water, and then up at her. "Thank you," he said. "For the water or the yes or possibly both." She didn't ask which. She sat back down. "The tree," he said after a moment. "The tree," she agreed. She told the children in the morning at breakfast without ceremony, because ceremony made things larger than they needed to be, and this thing was already large enough. She simply said, "Silas has asked me to marry him, and I've said yes. I wanted you to know." Samuel said, "Does that mean you're staying forever?" "Yes," Clara said. Samuel returned to his porridge with the satisfied air of someone whose primary concern had been addressed. Ida looked at Silas for a moment and then looked at Clara and said, "Will you still do my hair?" "Every morning," Clara said. "Okay," Ida said. Thomas looked at his plate and said nothing, which Clara had learned to read not as absence but as the particular processing of a child who needed to carry things quietly for a while before setting them down. Ruth was looking out the window when Clara said it and didn't turn around for a moment. When she did, her face was composed in the way it was always composed, 10 years old and armored with competence, but her eyes were doing something she couldn't entirely manage. "Ruth," Clara said. "I'm fine," Ruth said. The sentence wobbled slightly on the last word. "I know you are," Clara said. "But you're allowed to not be sometimes." Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove and flipped the next round of cornbread with a kind of controlled precision that said she was holding something together through activity, which was, Clara reflected, a thing she had learned from watching Clara herself. Eli was the last. He'd been listening from the doorway, half in and half out, as was his habit when things were happening that he hadn't anticipated. He looked at Silas. Silas looked back at him. Something passed between them that didn't have words, or didn't need them. The months of fence work and early mornings, and the two of them standing at the fence rail in the dark, asking honest questions. The particular accumulation of small things that turns a stranger into someone you know. Eli said, "Are you going to keep bossing me about the hay baling?" Silas said, "You're still doing it wrong." "I'm doing it faster," Eli said. "Fast and wrong," Silas said. Eli turned back to the table, and the thing that had been trying to happen at the corner of his mouth for 2 months finally happened, briefly, before he got it under control. They were married beneath the oak tree at the East Spring on a Saturday in early June, which was the first warm Saturday that didn't threaten rain. Frank and Dora Hennessy came. The Garner widow came in her buckboard with a covered dish and her rifle, which she left in the wagon this time. Caleb and Martin Phelps came. The Brant boy came with his parents, who turned out to be a compact, quiet couple, who shook hands with everyone and said very little and ate considerably. There was no minister. There had been some discussion about this, and Clara had resolved it by writing to the county seat for a civil officiant, a thin, formal man named Prescott, who arrived in a good coat and performed the ceremony with professional efficiency, and was clearly somewhat baffled by the assembled company, but managed his bafflement with dignity. The ceremony itself was short. Silas had written nothing down. When Prescott asked him to speak his intentions, he looked at Clara and said, "I intend to stay. Whatever comes. I'm not going anywhere. He paused. That's what I've got. Prescott waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. Clara said her piece from memory, the formal words, and then added, "And I want you to know that I think you're a better man than you believe yourself to be. I've had time to observe it." Something happened to his face. Prescott pronounced them married and looked slightly moved, despite himself. The children had argued about the food for 3 days beforehand. Samuel had been firm about the apple pie with the lattice top, which Clara made the night before from the dried apples she'd been storing, and which turned out adequate if not extraordinary. The lattice was slightly uneven because Ida had helped, which meant it was also slightly better than it would have been otherwise. Ruth made the bread. She'd gotten good at it. She made 3 loaves and they were gone within an hour of the meal starting, which she accepted with the dignified satisfaction of someone who expected competence from herself and was not surprised when it arrived. Thomas was put in charge of keeping Samuel out of the food before the meal was served, a job he performed with the focused seriousness he brought to most things, though Samuel escaped twice and had to be retrieved from the vicinity of the pie. Eli helped Silas set up the long table in the yard, borrowed pieces of wood on sawhorses, and covered with every flat cloth in the house. He was nearly 13 now, and in the weeks since the injunction and the commissioner's ruling, something in him had slowly, visibly shifted. Not toward childhood exactly, he was past that particular shore, but toward something younger than the worn, careful boy who had stood on the platform at Black Ridge Station in March. He laughed more. He argued with Silas about the hay baling with what was clearly as much affection as irritation. He slept past sunrise twice, which Clara considered a genuine milestone. Hattie and May, 14 months and walking now in the unsteady, determined way of children who have recently discovered the capability and intend to use it constantly, made their way around the yard under Ruth's intermittent supervision, investigating everything at knee height. May sat down in the dirt 3 times and got up each time with the philosophical air of someone who has accepted that this is part of the process. Frank Hennessy made a toast with a cup of something that was notionally cider and said, "George would have been glad," and meant it plainly, without making it a speech, and sat back down. Silas looked at his cup for a moment after that. Clara beside him put her hand briefly over his and then took it back, and he didn't say anything but his jaw moved slightly, the scarred side, the way it moved when he was feeling something he didn't have language for. The afternoon went long, the kind of afternoon that doesn't want to end, where people find reasons to stay. Another piece of pie, another cup, another conversation started at the edge of the table. The Garner widow got into a discussion with old Mr. Brandt about soil amendments that lasted 45 minutes and showed no signs of concluding. The Phelps brothers sat with Eli and talked about the summer hay prices with the earnest gravity of men 3 times his age, and Eli held his end of it, which made Clara notice and not say anything. When it finally wound down, and the horses were being hitched and the dishes collected and the borrowed table pieces returned to their origins, Clara stood at the edge of the yard and watched the people who had come. People who had had their own reasons for being here, some neighborly, some practical, some out of the particular solidarity of people who have lived near a bully long enough to want to see the room after he's left it. They had come for their own reasons. It didn't make the coming less real. Frank was the last to go. He shook Silas's hand at the gate and then turned to Clara. "Dora wants me to tell you," he said, "that she's glad you didn't get on the train." Clara smiled. It was not a polished smile. Her face was tired, the good kind of tired, and the smile came out slightly crooked. "Tell her so am I," she said. Frank rode out. The yard was theirs again. Chop-chop. Silas found her at the oak tree that evening, after the children were down, after the dishes were done, after the ranch had settled into its nighttime sounds. She'd come out without particularly deciding to, just walking in the direction of the spring, the way she'd started to do in the evenings when the day needed somewhere to finish. The tree was enormous up close, much older than the ranch, roots running down into the earth above the spring with the unhurried confidence of something that had been here long before any of this and intended to be here long after. She heard him coming. She'd learned his footsteps. The slight unevenness from an old injury to his left knee he'd never mentioned but that she'd noticed in cold mornings. He stood beside her and they looked at the water, where it came up through the rocks and made its quiet way toward the creek. The evening light was doing something specific to the surface. Not poetic, just light on water, the ordinary kind of beautiful that doesn't ask to be remarked on. I keep thinking about George, Silas said. I know, Clara said. Not in a bad way, just… He paused. I keep thinking he somehow knew that he wrote 11 letters to a woman he'd never meet and picked right. He shook his head slightly. That seems like too much credit to give a man who admitted in his letters he didn't know what he was doing. He was honest, Clara said. That was the thing about those letters. He was honest about what he didn't know. She looked at the water. I think that's its own kind of wisdom. He should have lived to see this, Silas said. Simply, not as a complaint against anything. Yes, Clara said. He should have. They stood with that for a moment, not trying to fix it, because some things don't fix. They just become part of the shape of everything else. George Mercer was in the wood of the barn he'd built, and the fence posts he'd set before his hands stopped working, and the 7 children asleep in the house behind them. He was in the spring that fed the valley, and the land that had almost been taken and wasn't. He was in the stubbornness of a man who wrote honest letters to a stranger because he believed, against evidence, that something good could still be built. I have something, Silas said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. Not a letter, she could tell from the size and the fold. He held it for a moment before handing it over. She opened it. It was a drawing, rough, done in pencil by a hand more accustomed to tools than art, but clear enough. A house, larger than the current one, with a real porch and 2 windows on the upper floor. A barn with an addition. A garden marked out in sections. The spring at the eastern edge, marked with a circle and the words, water, protected. In the corner, small but legible, for C, from S. Clara looked at it for a long time. The upper floor, she said. Eli and Thomas are going to need their own room eventually, he said. And I thought, Ruth ought to have somewhere that's hers. You drew this, she said. It's not good, he said. It's very good, she said. He looked at it over her shoulder. The proportions are off on the barn. Silas. The porch is wider in my head, he said. I just couldn't get it right on paper. Silas, she said again. He stopped. She folded the drawing carefully and held it. When did you do this? Week ago, he said. Couldn't sleep. She nodded. She was looking at the spring, the water moving in the fading light, and she was thinking about something her mother had told her once. That home was not a place you were born into, but a place you built, and that the building was the point, not the finishing, because finished things were finished and building things were alive. She had not understood it then. She understood it now, standing in the Wyoming evening with a folded drawing in her hand and a man beside her who had stopped running, and a house full of children behind her who had been afraid of being left and weren't anymore. We'll need lumber, she said. I know a man in town, he said. He owes Frank a favor, and Frank owes us one. We'll need time, she said. More than this summer. We've got time, he said. She looked at him. He was right. That was the thing about the land being clear. Not just the relief of it, not just the absence of Voss's deadline hanging over every morning, but the presence of something that had not been there before. Future. Plain, difficult, unguaranteed future, which was the only kind worth having because the guaranteed kind was just a story you told yourself. They had seasons ahead of them. Hard ones, probably, because the land was what it was, and the weather didn't ask what you could afford. They had a well that needed watching, and a milk cow with opinions, and 2 one-year-olds who were going to be 2-year-olds and then 3, and a boy of nearly 13 who was going to be a man faster than she was ready for, and a 10-year-old who was going to be something formidable when the world got out of her way long enough to let her. They had all of that. Come inside, Clara said. It's getting cold. They walked back together through the evening, across the yard with its new porch boards and its turned garden, past the fence that was finally standing straight. The lamp was on in the kitchen window. Ruth, probably, up past when she should be, reading or writing or doing one of the 10 things she did when she was supposed to be sleeping. At the door, Silas stopped. Clara. She turned. He was standing in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets and the stars coming out hard above him, and he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had spent a long time being lost and was not lost anymore, which did not make him simple or fixed or finished, but made him present, which was the more important thing. I just wanted to say it, he said. Out loud. He paused. I'm glad you wrote that letter. She looked at him standing there. I'm glad you read it, she said. She went inside. He stood in the yard for one more moment and looked up at the sky. Not searching for anything, just looking the way you look at something when you want to remember it. And then he followed her in. Tunk. In the months that followed, the Mercer Ranch was rebuilt. Not quickly, not without arguments over lumber costs and setbacks when the east wall framing went wrong twice before it went right, and a week in August when the creek ran low enough to worry everyone and then recovered. Not without the ordinary failures of people living closely together. The morning Silas and Eli didn't speak for a full day over something neither of them would explain to Clara, and the afternoon Ruth told Clara something in her voice that was more anger than she meant to show, and then went very quiet. And then, 3 hours later, came and sat at the table and said simply, I miss her, meaning her mother, meaning the particular grief of missing someone you barely remember, which is its own shape of loss. And Clara sat with her and did not try to make it smaller than it was. The upper floor went up in September, framed out by Silas and Eli and the Brant boy who showed up 3 weekends in a row without being asked. Ruth got her room. It was small, barely more than a space for a bed and a chest. But it had a window that faced east, and in the mornings the light came in at a specific angle across the floor that Ruth, who did not talk about beautiful things, was observed to sit in for 15 minutes before breakfast on the days when she rose early enough. Thomas, who had been watching and waiting and not speaking for months on end, opened up that fall in the particular way of children who do everything on their own schedule, suddenly and without warning. He talked. He had opinions about the hay baling technique, which he directed at Silas with the seriousness of a small engineer, and which turned out to be correct often enough that Silas listened. He became, that winter, the person who told the longest stories at dinner, delivered in his flat, unembellished way that somehow made them funnier than they had any right to be. Hattie and May turned 2 in the spring and became a different kind of problem than they had been as infants, mobile, opinionated, and possessed of a collaborative energy that suggested they had been working things out between them in their crib for months and were now ready to implement. May broke a window. Hattie bit Samuel, once, though no one was entirely sure why, and Samuel bore it with the philosophical resignation that was becoming his signature response to most of life's difficulties. Samuel, 5 years old, finally got his apple pie with the lattice top on his birthday, made properly this time, with real apples from the 3 trees Clara had planted against the south fence in early spring and which would not produce for years but would produce eventually, and that was the point. He ate 2 pieces and declared it exactly right. Clara did not stop being the woman she'd been before the train. She was not transformed by the frontier into something mythic or simplified. She was tired sometimes in ways that went past the body and into something harder to name. She made decisions she wasn't sure of and had to live with them. She was sharper than she meant to be on the mornings when the twins had been up twice and the weather was turning and the pantry was down to its last flour sack. She was human in the full, inconvenient sense of the word. But there was something she had not had before that she had now, and it was not happiness exactly. Happiness was too small a word, too temporary. It was more like solidity, like knowing the ground you're standing on. She'd come west believing that a life had to be given to you, by birth, by circumstance, by the plans of other people. She'd sat in her sister's spare room for 2 years waiting for something to change, and then a newspaper advertisement had arrived on her kitchen table, and she had looked at it for 3 days before picking it up, and another week before writing back. What she'd learned, not in a single moment, but in a slow accumulation of mornings and decisions and hours with her hands in the dirt, was that a life was not given. It was built. Out of whatever was available, out of the things that fell through and the things that held, out of the people you chose to stay for when leaving would have been easier. George Mercer had written her honest letters. He had told her the truth about the hard things and not promised her more than he had. He had looked for someone capable, and she had decided, in a spare room in her sister's house, that she was. She still was. The frontier had not made her that. She'd brought it with her. The frontier had just shown her what it was for. On a morning in late October, the first real cold of the coming winter laying a frost across the yard, Clara stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched Silas and Eli at the fence line. They were talking. She could see it from the movement, Silas making some point with his hands, Eli listening and then shaking his head and making a counterpoint, and Silas standing back with his arms folded and the look of someone considering whether to concede or hold. He conceded. She could tell from the shift. Eli put the fence post in the position he'd been arguing for, and it was right. And Silas looked at it and said something that made Eli look at his boots to hide what was happening to his face. Behind Clara, Ruth was at the table doing arithmetic. Real arithmetic. Beyond anything Clara had taught her, something she'd gotten from a book Holt at the trading post had ordered in from back east at Clara's request. The scratch of pencil on paper. Ida on the floor nearby with the twins, playing some game that had no discernible rules but consistent enthusiasm. Thomas somewhere upstairs doing something he'd been vague about for 3 days, which she trusted would reveal itself eventually. Samuel at the table eating his breakfast with his eyes still half closed, the morning's first light just coming through the window. The frost was on the yard and the mountains to the west had their first snow on the peaks, and the winter was coming the way it always came, without asking, without accommodation. She was ready for it. She had been here 7 months. She was not the same person who had stood on a train platform in March with a carpet bag and a letter she'd read until it was tearing. She was also, at her core, exactly that person. Both things were true, and she had stopped needing to resolve them. She drank her coffee. Outside, Eli said something to Silas, and Silas turned and looked at the house. At the new upper floor, the straight fence, the garden put to bed for winter under its straw covering, the porch where no boards were missing. And his gaze settled briefly on the window where Clara was standing. She didn't wave. He didn't gesture. They just looked at each other across the frost-covered yard for a moment, and that was enough. And then he turned back to the fence, and she turned back to the kitchen, and the morning continued. Clara Reed had come west to marry a stranger. She had arrived to find him gone. She had stayed anyway, for no better reason than that there were children who needed someone to stay, and she had been, against all probability, that someone. She had not been rewarded with an easy life. She had been given a hard one with people in it worth the hardship. The difference mattered. There is a kind of courage that announces itself, that stands in the center of things and knows it is being watched. And there is a quieter kind, the kind that gets off a train in the wrong place at the wrong time and picks up a carpetbag and says simply, "Show me where you're parked." She had the second kind. It was enough. It was, in the end, everything.